the newsagents.
What a great night. Pursuant to Rule 40D of the rules of the Republican Party, I formally declare President Donald J. Trump and J.D. Vance as the Republican nominees for President and Vice President of the United States.
The crowd is going wild for the 39-year-old Ohio Senator J.D. Vance. He's just been announced as Donald Trump's vice presidential pick. He's a man who, not long ago, referred to Trump as America's Hitler. He called him an asshole, in fact. But now, all that's forgotten. Welcome to the newsagents.
Tediously, it is John in London.
And Lewis in London.
And Emily in sunny, actually tornado-filled Milwaukee in Wisconsin. And I guess the point about saying overtly that you are never Trump is that you are never Trump. But this guy, J.D. Vance, has suddenly decided that he very much is Trump. And in fact, he's just become his VP pick. And it was a weird moment of sort of botched comms for about 5 minutes in the hall yesterday when we knew that this pick, the VP pick was coming, and everyone was kind of getting into the hall to try and get a flavour of, how it'd be announced and the roll call and the flags and the, shouting and all the rest of it. And then they sort of slipped it out really quickly to the point where people around us in the audience were going, what? Who did they say? What was going on? And everyone kind of missed it. And so they had to sort of then re-announce the fact that J.D. Vance was coming in with this long, big build-up where all the crews were kind of waiting for him to make his entrance onto the floor of the convention hall. And just to put this in context, J.D. Vance is the loyalist now of Trump acolytes. He's the Ohio Senator. He's only 39 years old. He's the first ever millennial to be a VP pick. I think he's the first bearded VP for 100 years. And he is somebody who has come from a life of poverty and privation and has written this extraordinary best-selling memoir, The Hillbilly Elegy, about his kind of childhood and life growing up. And from that basis, he always said he hated Trump's populism. He hated the way he was kind of commandeering the white working classes into this sort of phony kind of optimism. And then suddenly that all changed. Here's what he said in 2016 as a Yale graduate when he was dead set against the former president.
I'm a never Trump guy. I never liked him. And I've noticed this willingness from people who think a lot like I do that, look, we told you so. To all these white working class voters, we told you so. We told you that Trump was going to be a terrible candidate. We told you that you were an idiot if you voted for him. The problem is, if you take that attitude of sort of gloating over Trump's defeat, then you're playing into the very thing that gave rise to Trump in the first place, which is a feeling that the elites think that they're smarter than you and just think you're a bunch of idiots.
So the thing about Hillbilly Elegy as a book was that it charted the kind of lives of people who'd come from the Deep South, who find themselves in the industrial Northeast, where after the 2008 financial crash, there is huge opioid abuse, there are very dysfunctional families, there are broken neighbourhoods, and it kind of spoke to the 2016 election and the sense of alienation, disaffection of so many people. And Hillbilly Elegy, was the book you had to read in the lead up to the 2016 election to understand why Donald Trump was getting the support that he was in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania and the like. And it's a very good memoir. But J.D. Vance, since then, has been on a journey and has identified that his future lies with being almost even more Trump than Trump.
Yeah, and this is a guy, right, who once suggested that Donald Trump was America's Hitler. So he's gone from saying that to basically becoming his own Rudolf Hess in sort of one fell swoop, or along the journey anyway. And I think what it says, right, or what's interesting about it, is the confidence that Trump clearly has at this point in picking him. Because he could have, and indeed there was pressure on him from Republican elites, such as they still are, sort of more traditional party hands, to broaden the ticket to go for unity, right? There was this suggestion about maybe Nikki Haley. There was suggestion about Marco Rubio. And in doing so, for example, with Marco Rubio or someone, you could also say you could perhaps lock in some of your growing appeal on the Hispanic part of the electorate, or you go for somewhere that perhaps will help you geographically. Vance does none of this stuff. Trump's going to win Ohio anyway. The guy is now a kind of absolutely kind of born-again Trumpist, and someone who in so many ways gives ideological ballast to the America First project. And I think that what it says is, as I say, it talks about Trump's extreme confidence about this election already. And I think it also tells us something about the different place that the Trump project is in 2024 by comparison to where it is in 2016. In 2016, Trump was still a kind of nascent force within the Republican Party. He chose Pence because he felt he had to, in some ways, kind of balance the ticket and give something to the sort of more traditional Republican types and Republican Party hierarchies. Now he's completely dominant internally, and Vance is the guy who is going to advance his agenda once he is in office, because he is a guy who is a deep thinker, very politically able, and is completely serious about cementing Trump-type power and Trumpist America First type power within the institutions of American politics in a way they did not succeed in 2016, because frankly the whole thing was just too chaotic and Trump didn't know what he was doing.
Look, J.D. Vance is a hardline pro-lifer. He's anti-abortion, he's anti the use of IVF. There's a lot of anti-women in that before you even start to drill down. So I think the first thing it tells us is that Trump is at the moment pretty confident they're not about to swap out Joe Biden for Kamala Harris, because if they thought that he was going to face Kamala Harris, who's been very strong on the Democrats' abortion message, maybe you wouldn't be going for J.D. Vance. The other thing I think it tells you is that Trump, we know, likes clans. His children have been a part of everything he's done, from his business to his first campaign through his presidency. And I think J.D. Vance, a man who is literally half Trump's age, is meant to signal not just what happens in the election in 2024, which Trump now believes is pretty much sewn on, but actually that the party remains in Trump's image, that MAGA can be taken forward through the force of J.D. Vance, this man who has showed himself eminently malleable. The fact that he called Trump cultural heroin all those years ago suggests that actually he might have become addicted to a bit of that power now. He has seen the way through, and it's a way through that requires him to do and say whatever Trump requires as his loyal sergeant.
The first thing to say about that is that J.D. Vance has made clear that if he had been the vice president on January the 6th, he would not have certified Joe Biden's election victory. And so that goes to the point of him not being someone who will say to the president, Mr. President, are you sure about that? He's going to be the one who says, Mr. President, you want it? I'll do it.
He's an enabler.
He's an enabler of Donald Trump. And what was kind of, aside from the chaos of the first term, which was absolutely manifest every single day of it, was also the fact that there were those people who were acting as a sort of block, acting as a brake, acting as a kind of just a check and a balance on Donald Trump's kind of wilder excesses, the so-called grown-ups in the room. They've gone. The other thing is on foreign policy, and this I think is really fascinating. J.D. Vance is a believer in isolationism about American foreign policy. He's not a great believer in the rules-based order or the international architecture that was set up after the Second World War. And he's got some pretty strange views about the reality of life in modern Britain since the change of government on July the 4th. Have a listen.
By the way, I have to beat up on the UK just one additional thing. I was talking with a friend recently, and we were talking about, one of the big dangers in the world, of course, is nuclear proliferation, though, of course, the Biden administration doesn't care about it. And I was talking about, what is the first truly Islamist country that will get a nuclear weapon? And we were like, maybe it's Iran, maybe Pakistan already kind of counts. And then we sort of finally decided maybe it's actually the UK, since Labour just took over.
So the UK is an Islamist nation.
Someone sent that to me before it sort of started to take across British Twitter last night. And when I first saw it, I actually was about to retweet it, and then I actually thought, wait, has this been AI'd? and I didn't, because I thought it could be a deep fake, because I couldn't quite believe all that it was years ago. But of course it wasn't years ago, because he was talking about the Labour victory. This is the vice presidential candidate, as you say, John, who is probably the intellectual political heir apparent to the MAGA movement. Recycling kind of like alt-right, far-right, hard-right talking points about what is one of America's closest allies. We need to wake up to the fact, right, it's not just Britain, but Europe in general. We need to wake up to the fact that come January 2025, these guys, as things stand right now, are likely to be in the White House. That therefore the Republican Party in American politics will be at its most isolationist that it has been at any time since the 1940s. This is the most isolationist ticket of any a major American political party, either Democrat or Republican, since 1940 or 1930, even 1936. And that we need to wake up to the fact that we could have an administration for the first time in our lifetimes, arguably for the first time ever, that is actually antithetical, if not openly hostile to European security interests. There are two capitals that will have very different reactions to what is going on right now. One is Moscow, which will be thrilled, and one is Kyiv, which will be dismayed. And I thought the moment which summed that up perfectly last night was the crowd cheering J.D. Vance, an isolationist who has talked about how we should stop assisting and helping Ukraine, and booing Mitch McConnell, who used to be the Senate Majority Leader, the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, a classic old-school American Republican-style hawk, booing him as part of the party establishment. Just listen to what J.D. Vance has said about the Biden administration's efforts to give ammunition and arms and supplies and aid to Ukraine during the war.
It's ridiculous that we're focused on this border in Ukraine. I got to be honest with you, I don't really care what happens to Ukraine one way or another.
So yes, I mean, he is a man who thinks that negotiation with Putin should be first and foremost to, ending the war in Ukraine. And I guess this is the first time, to a more general point, that we have seen a convention entirely in Trump's image. In 2016, he was the kind of wrecking ball on the Republican Party. In 2020, the convention didn't really happen. And when you look around this hall now, I don't know how to phrase this more elegantly, but it is full of cranks and weirdos and people that most of the world has sort of quietly forgotten about. We bumped into Laura Loomer. She's a kind of Katie Hopkins equivalent. She was right in the centre of the convention floor yesterday, a conspiracy theorist who tried to tell me that assassination attempt on Saturday night was an inside job. And when I asked what inside job meant, she said the government. She thinks Joe Biden is behind the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. And we also bumped into Rudy Giuliani. Now, for most of our audience, they will have one image of Rudy Giuliani, and that's not the former mayor of New York who sort of gallantly held the city together after 9/11. It's of an old guy with black hair dye dripping down his face at the Four Seasons landscaping press conference that he held in his attempt to help Trump overturn the 2020 election. I mean, that was really his nadir in terms of being Trump's personal attorney who was then fighting to try and overturn the election results. Now, in the last few days, he has been told that his bankruptcy case has been thrown out. He now owes $148 million that he cannot pay down to two Georgia election officials who he accused of fiddling with election results. So when I sat down with Rudy Giuliani, I wanted to ask him if he had any regrets about that appearance at the Four Seasons Landscaping and about the part he played in trying to overturn the elected result of an election. But I started by asking him about the documents case that has now been thrown out in Mar-a-Lago and whether Americans should still have faith in their own rule of law. Do you not believe the 34 convictions against Donald Trump now?
Do I believe him? I was a prosecutor who prosecuted more crime in the 20th century than anyone. The 4 cases against Donald Trump are a frame-up devised by Biden and his crooked attorney general.
And is the same true of the Hunter Biden case?
The Hunter Biden case I investigated myself. The Hunter Biden case is an attempt to charge him with the least crime that he committed.
So that one should stand?
Yeah, but it's almost meaningless. Hunter Biden should go to jail for the rest of his life. Hunter Biden, in his own words, gave half of his income to his father for 30 years. Nobody tells you that. They hide it.
Steve Bannon, of course.
Hunter Biden has taken money from our enemies. He's taken $31 million from China and a $1.5 billion investment in his private equity fund where he was a partner with an organized criminal. And he has said in his own text that for 30 years I give half my income to my father. The idea that there's no evidence against Joe Biden of actually taking bribes is a complete lie. I have the evidence. I produced it 5 years ago, and that's why they persecute me.
And would you have any advice for Steve Bannon, who's serving his own time in prison at the moment?
He should have been released for the same reason that the Donald Trump case was dropped. The Donald Trump case was dropped because it was an illegal appointment of a very, very dishonest, dishonorable, and unethical prosecutor. I mean, Smith, if you were looking for a guy to frame someone, you'd pick Smith. He had a case before where he did that to a Republican governor. The Supreme Court 8-0 reversed him, including the liberal justices, for his terrible conduct. So when Garland picked him, Garland knew what he was picking. He was picking a dishonest, dishonorable prosecutor who frames Republicans.
What would you say to people who think the Supreme Court has basically been reinvented now in Trump's image and have real grave concerns about the direction of rule of law now in America?
Well, I mean, there is no rule of law in America, and the Democrats have removed it. I don't get the same justice a Democrat gets. As a Republican, I've been completely treated totally differently and had civil cases against me where I didn't even get a chance to defend myself for hundreds of millions of dollars. They were attempting to put me in prison for the rest of my life on things I never did with people I never heard of. The Democratic Party has no right to talk about ending democracy because they ended it. Remember, Donald Trump was president for 4 years. There was no evidence of any deprivation of democracy. Donald Trump did not prosecute his predecessor. It's Joe Biden who did that
and when
multiple times. So what we have going on is the typical Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden projection. They accuse you of what they do, and they have destroyed our criminal justice system, and it's a tragedy.
So when
I
you
have to get to my show.
Just last question, when you think back to the fight that you put on after the 2020 election to take that election from Joe Biden, and people will be remembered of the Four Seasons landscaping, all the rest of it.
That's a terribly prejudiced statement you just made, that we took the election from Joe Biden.
No, you didn't. But
if you are fair, and you allow us to have our own opinion, Joe Biden stole that election.
You stand by that?
Just stand by it. I've got the evidence in my home. I mean, I was cut off in court. I've been prosecuted for it. I have the evidence. Just 3 weeks ago, the state of Georgia announced that there are 375,000 missing ballots. Now,
so you have no regrets about the part that you played in that?
My goodness. If it wasn't for me, Joe Biden would be sailing by and nobody would know that he's a 35-year crook who's taken well over $50 million. He is the most dishonest, most dishonorable president in our history. And he spent his whole life taking bribes. And as you see, when he appears now, whether it's dementia or not, he really isn't a person.
So I think that's so interesting, Emily, because we mentioned on the podcast, there's kind of breaking news when we were recording, that the judge, Aileen Cannon, who had been a Trump-appointed judge, let me underline, had thrown out the documents case, the classified documents case. And I just thought the timing of it, and as I've reflected on it over the past 24 hours, it seems to me that something really important and potentially kind of quite discomforting is happening. That there is now, because Donald Trump has been shot at, a kind of new definition of what it means to have American unity, and that
what's good for Donald Trump is American
unity is you don't say anything nasty about him.
Yep.
You forget about January the 6th. You don't have any prosecutions of him, and that way we as a country can come together. And the space has been opened up that Aileen Cannon, the judge, has gleefully kind of filled by saying, right, we're throwing out this case. And I think there is something potentially, we talked yesterday about, is it real that Donald Trump is now a changed person and that he's a uniter rather than a divider? And I think, yeah, he's a uniter. as long as it's entirely on his terms, and Democrats don't know where to go with it.
The conversations in this hall are utterly dystopian. If you ask them whether it matters that Donald Trump's a convicted criminal, they will tell you he isn't. They simply don't believe it. If you ask whether Hunter Biden is a convicted criminal, they'll say he didn't get long enough and his dad should be in prison too. There is literally total asymmetry on how the people here see the rule of law. I used to think that they were kind of turning it on, putting it on, trying to spin this to the media. But I think something has actually happened. I think it has become more cultish. I genuinely think the people who are spouting this garbage are starting to believe what they're saying. And I should just say before we go, I mentioned the weirdos and the misfits. I mean, there is a really kind of distasteful thing going on, which is the RNC seems to be where sort of former celebrities come to reinvigorate their fallen celebrity status.
Liz
and
Truss?
one of the people that we saw, well, funny you mention, Liz Truss, Boris Johnson, who spoke yesterday to an absolutely empty room. We couldn't believe the pictures. We were expecting it to fill up until we understood that that was as full as the room was going to get. But the other person that I bumped into was Russell Brand, who was on a talk show called Patriot. And he had with him a very young female assistant who was trying to keep us as far away from him as she could. And I was listening quite intensely to the interview. And the last question that the interviewer asked was, "So, Russell, there are a lot of young men listening to you here." And I thought, oh, he's going to go for it. Here's the bullseye. And then he said, "Tell us about fatherhood." It was unbelievable to see how much latitude and how much encouragement somebody who has been accused of multiple sexual allegations will get in a place like this. None of that was discussed yesterday. And when he came off air, I tried to grab his arm. He shot me daggers and fled.
Can't imagine why.
Funny that, he wasn't going to
It
get
is
that
weird.
sort of question from you.
Any luck finding our Liz?
It's quite confusing because she posted a picture of herself yesterday wearing a long flowing red dress, and dare I say that everyone at the Republican Party who is female is wearing a lot of red and long flowing
For
red
once in her
dresses.
life, she's
So I've
fitting
been-
in.
I've accosted everyone I can find, and they look horrified when I ask them if they're Liz Truss.
Well, I met her at the Spectator party last week, and she looked pretty horrified when I tried to speak to her as well.
That's just how everyone reacts to you.
That's
To be fair to her.
Maybe that's just us. Look, in a moment we will be back with maybe not the global politics of the Republican convention, but what is happening in Wales and the leader of the Welsh Assembly having resigned.
4 members of Vaughan Gething's cabinet had resigned en masse in unison earlier today, and we now just have a statement from the First Minister of Wales, Vaughan Gething, saying, "I have this morning taken the difficult decision to begin the process of stepping down as leader of the Welsh Labour Party and, as a result, as First Minister."
So that was the breaking news this morning on Sky, that Vaughan Gething, the First Minister of Wales, the leader of the Welsh Labour Party, is stepping down after just 4 months in the job, 4 months that have been plagued by an allegation that he took a £200,000 donation from someone who had a criminal offence as a result of breaking environmental regulations. And the pressure has never gone away, and there was a no confidence vote a little while ago, which was sort of brushed off as, it's just politics, you can soldier on.
Yeah, look, Gething's period as First Minister has been deeply destabilising for the Labour Party in Wales. It's been deeply destabilising for the institution of the Senate, really, which has had perhaps its most checkered period since it was created in the late 1990s as part of the devolution settlement. There's basically 2 big reasons why Gething has resigned. Well, 3 really, actually. You've talked about one of them, which is this £200,000 donation, which he received for his leadership campaign. It has dogged him throughout that entire period and since. And remember, he only narrowly won the Welsh leadership vote. It was a gift from a recycling company owned by a guy called David Neal, businessman. He received a suspended prison sentence in 2013 over the illegal dumping of waste. In February last year, a subsidiary of his main company received a £400,000 loan from the Development Bank of Wales, during which time, that fell under Gething's remit as economy minister, as he was then. So you can see that from the very beginning, there was an accusation of, at the very least, a perception of a conflict of interest. Gething and his supporters kind of dismissed this time and time again, but it never, ever went away. And, Jeremy Miles, who is one of the ministers who resigned from his government today and was the person that Gething beat back in March, only narrowly, as I say, said today that the dispute was damaging the party, distracting the Welsh government. He said in his resignation statement, "I cannot see any way forward which allows us to get on with the job we are elected to do without you standing down." And that was echoed by the 3 other ministers who resigned. And bear in mind, when we're talking about 4 ministers, like in a British context, we might be like, so what? There are only 14 ministers in the Senate, right? So if you take out Gething itself, that is going on for a third of Gething's ministerial team this morning resigned, saying that he had to go.
I suppose the remarkable thing about this is that when you consider it, and you talked about the perceived conflict of interest or the kind of dot joining that was possible as a result of the job he had and what happened to this waste disposal company, is how did he ever think that this would be all right? Now, I know there is a difference. If you're a politician, it's not a question of I did nothing wrong. It's absolutely fine. I know I can satisfy myself. I did nothing wrong. But the perception of wrongdoing is so corrosive, and the perception that you are just kind of self-serving and being there because you like being there is really bad for politics. And so, when this news broke, I kind of thought, yeah, well, that was kind of coming, wasn't it?
Well, we asked him about it when he came on the show. We interviewed him on the show for a Friday show, not long after he became First Minister. Inevitably, we asked him about it. And at the time, I did think he did seem remarkably blasé about it. And even the way he addressed it seemed pretty odd to me. Just listen to this.
You have to acknowledge that political parties raising their own money means that there is a relationship between money and politics. What I've always been clear about is that I have not surrendered any kind of policy initiative for people who contribute.
But people have accused you of so doing.
No, but that's an accusation.
Because in 2016,
that's an
you
accusation
asked Natural Resources Wales to ease restrictions on Atlantic Recycling, a firm run by the guy who gave you the money. So you can understand, of course, you deny any impropriety, but the perception, you can understand, is there.
But that is always the problem, isn't it? If people make...
Well, it wouldn't be if you gave the money back.
No, people who make baseless accusations don't need to then stand those up. I'm a constituency member. It's my job to represent my constituents. I've always done that, and I'll carry on doing that as well. If you look at what...
And there were a couple of other reasons he resigned as well. And the thing about Welsh politics, or what happens in the Senate, it does get a lot less attention than certainly, of course, what happens in Westminster nationally, but even by comparison to what happens in Holyrood or Stormont, all of them. The Senate, for lots of reasons that maybe we can get into another time, it does tend to receive less attention from the national press. But this has been going on. His sort of travails have been rocking Welsh politics in Cardiff Bay basically from the beginning, and have really intensified in the last couple of weeks. If anything, the general election probably deferred all of this or put it all on hold, because of course the Welsh Labour Party had to kind of just sort of get in behind the national campaign. But there's been this other sort of rumbling scandal which has been going on, which is that he fired his Minister for Social Partnership, Hannah Blythyn, in May, alleging she was the source of a news story that revealed he deleted messages from a group chat during the COVID-19 pandemic. Gething was also another one of these ministers like, Boris Johnson or Nicola Sturgeon, who as a senior minister
mysteriously lost their WhatsApp
handling the COVID pandemic. Mysteriously all of those messages just went missing. Gething insisted the leak came from her phone, an allegation she denied. He declined to offer any evidence for the sacking and didn't commission a leak inquiry. And in a highly unusual move, the actual nation.cymru, the website who had the story, actually said that Blythyn was not the source. So all of these things came together, and then you add in the fact, as you've said already, John, that he lost a motion of no confidence. Not the government, he personally lost a motion of no confidence, or a vote of no confidence in the Senate. And when you consider that they have 30 of the 60 seats, he should have been able to win that. But he had a couple of his own MSs, the equivalent of MPs, who just didn't turn up that day. So it was very, very clear for quite a long time that he just did not have the support of his own party, let alone the Senate overall. And that's ultimately why he had to go. And the way he handled that by basically very breezily going like, this is a political stunt or whatever, it was quite reminiscent of sort of some of Boris Johnson's tricks. And I asked Emily Thornberry during the general election campaign on my LBC show about this. And likewise, her response really disturbed a lot of people within Welsh politics as well and Welsh Labour, because it just sounded like the National Labour Party was treating the institutions of Welsh Labour and the Senedd with disrespect.
I think it's really sad at a time of a general election that the opposition parties, the Conservatives in particular, are kind of resorting to these sorts of gimmicks. The guy's just been elected, and there's a
motion of no confidence. He's lost it. 2 of his own members didn't vote for him. How can he possibly stay on?
Two of his own members were ill and weren't able to attend, and if they had, then it would have gone another way.
So Keir Starmer lost
it. It's a non-binding gesture, and I think there are more important things going on in Wales than that.
If Keir Starmer lost a motion of no confidence in the House of Commons, in him personally or in the PLP, he'd stay on. He'd be fine with that.
He's not going to lose one, is he? Though,
so it's just a matter of practicality.
No, it's not a matter of practicality. I'm just trying to answer some of your more odd questions. There are many other things happening in Wales.
It's an odd question about the First Minister of Wales, Emily Thornberry, losing a motion of no confidence. Isn't that rather dismissive of the Senedd?
No, I wasn't dismissing that. What I was dismissing was the idea that.
Yeah, whatever, Lewis. Stop asking pesky questions. My guess is, that was Emily Thornberry, who was then a shadow minister and is now not a minister, as Keir Starmer chose not to appoint her to any role in the new government. I would imagine in Downing Street, quiet relief, thank you. That is one problem that has now been sorted, dealt with, gone. There was no one trying to rescue, I would guess, at the end of it. Although it does leave a question about where this leaves devolution.
Yeah, I think there are 2 big questions arising from this, which are connected, though not necessarily the same. One is, what does it mean for Welsh Labour? We sometimes talk about the SNP hegemony in Scotland, and that's gone on since 2007. Welsh Labour have controlled the Senedd, the Welsh Parliament, Assembly as it then was, since it was created in 1998, 1999. It is astonishing the strength of Welsh Labour at a time when Labour nationally has been very weak throughout much of that time is extraordinary. But there are real questions and worries for Welsh Labour that perhaps this is starting, the edifice is really starting to crack. You've got a Welsh election in 2026, Plaid are polling pretty well, and the one other party that is polling really well, I think people haven't noticed as much, is Reform. We associate Reform often with kind of the Red Wall, Northern England, and all these sorts of places, English coastal towns. Actually, UKIP always had a really strong place in Wales. They'd actually had some really good results in the general election in Wales, and of course, the Welsh Senedd has a proportional system. So it would enable them, they would be in a far better position to be able to have a breakthrough in Wales than elsewhere. And they've got lots of issues on which they can run, right? Like, look at the 20 mile per hour speed limit. That is classic, ripe territory for Reform and Farage to absolutely hammer at for the next 2 months. And then there's a wider question as well about the health of the devolution settlement. We've seen what's happened in Scotland with what happened with Hamza Yousaf. We've seen now what's happened in very short order with Vaughan Gething. And there are more and more people in Westminster, particularly on the right, especially really exclusively on the right, who are arguing more loudly that the devolution settlement as set up by Blair has failed. I would not be surprised. I don't think that's necessarily fair, but I think that's what they will argue. I would not be surprised at all if one of the candidates for the Conservative leadership contest runs on a platform, or at least this is part of their platform, that the next Conservative government will either abolish or, more likely, significantly rein in the powers of the devolved parliaments.
We will be back in a moment with someone else who has quit their job today. Not Lewis Goodall.
Not yet. It's only 1:30.
So I feel simultaneously sad that Gareth Southgate has gone as England manager, but also as an England fan who's travelled the world to watch England play, kind of relieved as well, because I felt after this tournament he had gone as far as he was going to go as England manager. But he's been a memorable manager for a lot of very good reasons.
Gordon Brown always used to say you only got 7 years in anything, in sort of public life. 7 years was the kind of maximum. That's why he was so constantly agitating to take over because he was obsessed
that he would only get 7. And he only got 3.
Well, yeah, but or more that he was in the public eye for so long already, and people would already be bored with him. And it feels like, I mean, these things are always a bit artificial, but it does feel to me. I always, we've talked before. I personally think it'd be really hard for a prime minister like Blair or Thatcher to do 10 years now, because I think the rate of the news cycle has sort of accelerated so much. People just get bored, and they, you can see in Southgate's trajectory as a media story, right? You can see the arc of it, right? You can see the kind of like, here's a guy with an astonishing kind of personal connection to this team and something to prove, and he wants to exorcise that day. And what was it? Was it Euro 96 that he didn't get the penalty and so on? And but no one has any expectation. Wow, he does really well, and he keeps carrying the wave, and it keeps going, and then suddenly it all sort of goes away. And it was hard. You could sort of feel it in this tournament in terms of the media treatment of him. It was like they just wanted a new story to write, which is of his failure, his decline, and so on.
So anyway, let us hear from people who know their on this subject. Not Lewis Goodall and John Sopel, but Mark Chapman and Gabby Logan on The Sports Agents.
When you think that all England fans and England want is to win the tournament, that's fine. But then when you actually look at all the different layers that go into this job, and you think that the England men's head coach role in particular, has now led to discussions on race relations, war in Ukraine. I mean, I've heard him being asked questions, who gives weapons to Israel at the moment in everything that's going on there. He has answered questions on all of those. Now, as a sort of employer, you just want someone really to win the World Cup or the Euros. But actually, through the recruitment process, you're going to have to take into account all these other things, which some people will say have nothing to do with football, but have become more and more to do with football.
I'm sure there are going to be theses written and PhDs about his impact, actually, without overstating this, on the country, and that kind of father of the nation role almost that he has been able to adopt while he's been head of the England setup, the head coach, the face, the voice, that taking that responsibility. And you think back to kind of how peaceful this tournament has been in terms of England fans not getting into trouble on the streets of Germany, which would have been unthinkable. You think back to Euro 2000 and the kind of rioting on the streets of the Netherlands and Belgium, and troubles that have been even at the Euros in France. And I just don't think it's a coincidence with the way he leads and talks as to how, while the fans might have voiced their disquiet at certain games, and they will say that's their right, actually there has been a prevailing kind of mood of peace amongst fans when they've travelled. And England fans, as we know, have not always had that reputation. So his impact and his influence has been enormous. And I just think the way he's connected with female fans, again, we shouldn't take for granted that relationship over 10 years ago was very different as well, and the way women wanted or not to follow England because of all those cultural, historical, negative baggages that they were carrying around. So it's really quite seismic, I think, how he's changed the mood around England culturally. And as Mark says, that's a lot to ask, isn't it, of somebody to take on that mantle.
I really sort of resonate with what she says there in a sense that, I only really follow football when England is playing, and that preceded Southgate. But I have to say that, he has, whatever else, there'll be people far better qualified than certainly me to talk about, his merits and demerits as a football manager. But in terms of his connection to England as a nation, and his ability to articulate a type of Englishness, particularly in was it the 2020, 21 kind of period, I think he managed to do something that people in politics have often talked about, often struggled to achieve, which is a progressive way of talking about Englishness that is not boorish, that is not leery, that is not nationalistic, but is deeply patriotic and deeply proud. And he calibrated that so perfectly. And I think that whatever happened with football, I do think that is a real legacy, because England has so few cultural institutions of its own. It's a weird nation. It's a country which has such a strong sense of itself and such a weak one at the same time, and one that, apart from the England football team, does not have. We don't have our own political institutions. We don't have many of our own cultural institutions. They all get subsumed by the British whole, unlike Scotland and Wales. But the England football team is somewhere where Englishness rests, and I think he articulated that and had the custodianship of that so admirably.
I think that the whole idea of progressive patriotism is really interesting. And because when people say, I'm a true patriot, it is normally Nigel Farage or it is Lee Anderson, and it is kind of very much performative waving of St George's flags, or I'm having a full English breakfast, when will I be banned from eating this? It's kind of, you know, your cufflinks and your socks and all the rest of it. And unless you're doing that, you're not a proper patriot. And I thought that, you know, I mean, I remember that, I mean, I think we've talked about this once before, about George Orwell's essay on sort of Englishness, I think written in 1941 during the Blitz, and bombs are falling all around him. And he's talking about what are the true characteristics. And it's a fantastic, extraordinary essay. And yet, I think that what Gareth Southgate did in his Dear England letter was the sort of continuity of that.
I agree, yeah.
And it was a really interesting thing that was done and that he did. And he found the voice. This footballer who'd best remembered for missing a penalty was now England manager and found a way to articulate an idea of England that was inclusive, that was multiracial, that was kind of, again, as we heard from Gabby there, inclusive of women and bringing more people in. And it changed the England team. It changed some of the England supporters, and I would say for the better.
Would you have? What would you think? Odds do you think you'd have got a few months ago for Southgate and Gething going on the same day? I bet some of the lads in Rishi Sunak Downing Street managed to do it.
Look, if I was going to the bookies, you know, the really clever bet would have been to have had Biden as well on a treble.
Yes. Where are those Sunak fellas? Just if you're going past your local corals, then just check to see if they're in there collecting some winnings, because I think we need to tell a gambling commission about it.
We'll be back tomorrow with the King's Speech.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.